Okay, so let's start. Welcome to our webinar, Unlock the Secret of Successful Fundraising in North America. And I hope at the end of this hour, you will tell us that you have discovered a lot of secrets and a lot of things that you didn't know yet. So I'm really curious about what you will tell us afterwards. My name is Anna, and I am the Executive Director of the Chapel & York European Foundations. I'm your moderator for today. And I'll just quickly give you an overview who Chapel & York actually is. We call ourselves the home of international philanthropy. We have over 25 years of experience in this field, like 25 years of existence, but a huge network of experts, so a lot more than 25 years of experience. We have transferred over 1 billion pounds sterling to our clients over all these years, and we have now offices in 9 different countries in the world. We use 2 different strategies, so we help our clients with international fundraising, but we also provide essential support for tax-effective giving through a network of foundations and through our charity management. You will hear about this later also. For this webinar, we have put together a very short agenda so that you know what we are talking about. We will give you a quick overview of the potential of North America and especially of the US and Canada. We will give you a very extensive insight into the US fundraising market, where we will hopefully unlock all the secrets on the examples of the arts and the education sector. We will tell you how to actually access the precious funding that you will raise in these countries. And we will obviously have quite some time at the end for question and answers. If you have any questions in the meantime during the presentation and during my colleagues giving you their secrets, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I will monitor the chat. If it's questions of clarification, we will take them right away. If it's rather questions about content, etc., we will bundle them together at the very end. And in case that we are really running out of time and don't have time to answer questions, we will answer all your questions by email. So please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I am not alone, as you have seen. I am accompanied by 4 of our experts, which I will very quickly introduce. The first one is Laure Vienot. She is currently based in France. She is initially trained as an engineer, turned to the nonprofit sector about 10 years ago while she was living in the States. She has exclusive and extensive experience in fundraising with individual and corporate donors, patron cultivation and committee management, and she has been the former executive director of the American Friends of the Paris Opera. Laure, I'm very happy to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward for your presentation of secrets of fundraising for the arts sector. Then we have with us Brad Smith. Brad Smith is living and working in the US. He has a long career in fundraising in the educational sector. He has been, amongst others, for more than 11 years with the precious MIT, and has profound experience with major donor fundraising. Brad, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you.
The next one will be Heather Hill. Heather Hill also lives and works in the States at the moment. She's the head of international philanthropy at Chapel & York, and she is also the former executive director of the Chapel & York US Foundation. She is highly rated as an international speaker and has authored several well-received articles in journals such as the Chronicle of Philanthropy in the US or Fundraising Europe in the Netherlands, just to name a few, on the topic of international fundraising. And I just discovered also, it has been a few years back, that she has won an award for one of her fundraising campaigns around Giving Tuesday for excellency in philanthropy. That was a really nice discovery, actually, when I prepared this webinar. And last but not least, we have with us Arnaud Marcilhacy. He is the head of Chapel & York International Fundraising Department. He has over 20 years of experience in several sectors. He has worked in the education sector, cultural sector, in medical research, and for several international non-profit organizations, such as World Vision in Canada, for instance. He has lived and worked in Canada, France, Belgium, Switzerland, and in French-speaking Africa. And he's here with us today, and he will give you a very quick overview about on who he's actually working with.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everybody. It's very nice to have you today. Like Anna said, I have 20 years of experience in fundraising internationally, North America and Europe. And you know, I still learn every day. And I think what you're going to hear today is a great webinar. And I actually learned from what my colleagues are going to discuss with you today. So welcome to everyone. Just a few words about the fundraising department at Chapel in New York. To make a long story short, 9 months ago, Nancy Bixson, our managing director, asked me to build a very strong fundraising department. And our first goal was to put together a group of experts, what we call experts, Chapel in York experts in various fields of fundraising, you know, major gift, prospect research, case writing, stewardship events, you name it. And in all sectors like higher education, arts and culture, environment, humanitarian, etc. And during these 9 months, we've talked to great people. We activated our various networks. And I can say that after 9 months, we gave birth to what I think is probably the best group of international fundraising experts in the world. We have now about 35 experts from North America to Europe to Asia, and as far as New Zealand. Actually, one of our best experts is based in New Zealand. And Brad Smith, who's speaking today, is one of our experts, and I have the privilege to work with him on a great client from the UK willing to fundraise in America. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass the floor to my colleagues. Just, you know, we're here for you. If you need help to fundraise abroad, just talk to me, to Laure, who's part of my team, and we'll be really happy to help you. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much. And this brings me straight into the topic of fundraising in North America. As you can see from the slides that I've just put on the screen is what we have transferred only in 2022 to clients who are working with us. So these are quite some impressive numbers, actually. In the US, it was more than 46 million. In Canada, it's around 670,000 euros if I use the exchange rate of today, right? And we have worked with organizations in 12, respectively, 4 different countries. In general, the US market is very prone to international fundraising. They are the #1 market when it comes up to cross-border philanthropy. And by cross-border, I really mean the donor is in the US and the organization is outside the US, right? And the private philanthropy has nowadays outgrown the government development assistance. So there is a huge potential, and it keeps growing over the last few years. Canada is amongst the top 10 countries. It's ranked on place number 6, and we can see a steady increase over the last years. We ourselves have set up our own foundation only 1.5 years ago, and for this, we consider to have quite a success already. But for all the details on how to actually fundraise in these countries, I'll hand over to my colleagues, and Laure will start on the example of the arts to unlock her secrets for you. If you have questions, as I said, type them in the chat. Unfortunately, I can't see any. I can't see the options of raising hands. So please type them in the chat so that we don't miss anything. Thank you, Laure. Yours to go.
Yes, thank you, Anna. So as Anna is saying, my bit is going to be a bit more specific towards fundraising around the arts. We can just scroll to the next page. And again, we only have so much time. There is many more that we can discuss about. So we'll be happy to follow up with you, either Q&A or any sort of following up afterwards. I guess my first question is, beside this numbers, amazing numbers that Anna's mentioning, and the tremendous wealth that, we all are kind of looking at from the US, why should we actually really think about it, and why does this make sense? This picture here, I wanted to make it very, stay with this. Yeah, so I'm put on this picture the two very French, iconic, I would say, building, Versailles and the Opéra de Paris, to highlight that typically those two have undergone incredible renovations thanks to American money, thanks to American donation. Versailles typically, that was not quite recent, because there is really a whole lot of history between American supporters and France in this case. Versailles was, at the end of the First World War, was actually in very bad shape, and it was Rockefeller who actually wrote to the French president saying, "May I help? May I do something about it? This is actually, this is important for the world, basically." And he gave what is the equivalent of $30 million in the 1920s. Equivalent of today, $30 million. And Opéra de Paris is another example that's much more recent, was basically my years out there. But it's another example where we've had the opera want to change all the floors of all the studios, which is a lot of floors. And when you do have some sort of public establishment, as we'll discuss further what that means, but it entails the fact that every time you want to go through construction, you have to go through actually asking for bidding. And in this case, the Paris Opera wanted a specific type of flooring that has been studied as being the best for preventive injuries for the dancers. So they did not want to go through the process of asking for quotation and having several bids. So we ended up having an American donor, American patrons, send a gift to the American friends of the Paris Opera, and the Paris Opera make a in-kind donation to the opera. So we actually gave them the boards, the floor, which was a really interesting way to have this workaround and have this amazing gift coming from the US to support this typically French organization. So these two highlights just to say, yes, even when you think about something that's very, very European, you find out that we have been having support from the American markets for a very long time, and it's still going on. So small detour on this. Can you just go to the next slide? This is a little bit of a blurry one, but the idea here is to show you that philanthropy is essential for the arts. Basically, the light green portion means generosity compared to the dark green, and then this is by field. The idea here is to say that depending on the fields, generosity may be key for actually conducting your mission. In this one, this is a study in France. On the left-hand side, you have medical research, which obviously generosity is always useful, but it may, in this case, not be vital to conducting your mission. Where on the arts, which is on the right-hand side actually of this graph, you see pretty much only light green. So we know that philanthropy is really essential for the arts. The not so good news, though, is when we look at the next one, is that philanthropy is not, or generosity, even in the US, like to the next one, Hannah, even in the US, the arts are not the first recipient for generosity, for a few reasons. One is that it's actually quite recent. Philanthropy dates back to the 1700s, but the philanthropy for the arts is more dated in, let's say, the 70s. And it's also unfortunately suffering from the image of elitism and inequality, even more so now that we have scrutiny, yeah. Looking at the leadership and the boards of some organization, and we even have donors who would maybe said that they would stop donating to an organization until we make sure this sort of elitism is sort of taken care of. It's also always been suffering from not being considered the most important case. You know, it comes maybe after environmental causes and social causes. So we have to keep this in mind, you know, when we're looking at the market still. Which brings me to my next one, which is yes, but then let's look at the art as underlying for any other causes, right? There is always to do this. It's true everywhere, but I've sort of like witnessed it to be even more so a possibility in the US. So why not say, you know, look at the art to the another angle, right? To the angle of well-being. I mean, there are researches proving how the arts can improve some of the psychological well-being of individuals through accessibility, since we just mentioned the issue of elitism, to social justice, as we are thinking music and I mean the arts in general are a way to express sort of the raw emotions that are needed in social changes, looking through the prism of education and knowing, again, we have studies showing how the arts is, you know, studying arts improves, I would say, results in any kind of other education curriculum, and then making use more job ready, I want to say. So looking at these sort of angles in general, just sort of looking at the other aspect around arts is something that has proven to be quite efficient. Now, before we go more into, can skip to the next one. Before we go more into some specifics about fundraising, I also want to look at the basic sort of economical model and see how this is completely different from typically European market to US market. So the study I've used here is actually a study that has been done by the French government on a series of most of the actually Parisian museums. Again, I use the French one just because it was easier for me to get my hands off, but it's the sort of similar ratios we're finding in various European countries. And this is for what we call a public museum, but what we call public museum means that it's mostly funded for by the government, which in the case of France, again, is the vast majority of the museums. The graphs are really small. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're looking at the red portion, which is the average across all those museums. And the left-hand side sort of shows how much they rely on fundings, which is close to 60%. And out of that, the right-hand side one is actually that's not exactly right. It's how much the city itself is actually funding them. So it means it's government funded. It's even local government funded. That's how much the government is putting its hands onto the survival and the mission actually of the organization. So if you look at the other one, which is the flip side, which is the earned income, just get to the next one. The earned income is automatically sort of on the low side, which is close to 30%. And it's made out of only 50% is ticket sale. And that's even in Paris, which means if you're going in the countryside, it's much smaller, less foot traffic. The rest of it being sort of rental income and even renting arts and goods to other museums, and then some tiny things such as, you know, the cafe and postcards, but really that's what it is. So when we look at the American model for financing the arts, it's much more balanced, I want to say, relying on sort of a three-legged stool, with the earned income being really the first one, was the ticket sale. And that compares to, you know, the half of the third of the earned income that we were talking about just before. The second one being, there again, government, but the solid third being the generosity, private generosity. with also the reality that the private donations come with fewer strings than the government one, which allows for the organization to be a bit more creative, and for individual to basically be more interested in supporting an organization, because they have innovative ways to go about it. Okay, so that's just kind of like getting you the scene. And again, in that last sort of bit, in terms of having the landscape, can you go one more? We all know that giving is actually part of the culture in the US, right? It's, as I mentioned, it's dating back from the 18th century, and these are actually two sort of little experience, I would say, or no, not experience, so sharing experience from 200 years apart, right? The first one, Alexis de Tocqueville, was a French servant, a civil servant who was sent to the US to study the American penal system, actually, initially, though he really had some intention into looking at the learning from the politics there to serve his own purpose with the government. But what was quite striking is that in his own reports back then, he already noticed this tendency for the citizen to group together to be able to solve problems through associations, which is really the beginning of this non-for-profit mindset. And 200 years later, it really is part of the cultural habits. And it's something that's really ingrained within what it means to be American. So with that in mind, one of the topics I wanted to talk about was, just the next one, was US board members in the US. What does it mean to be a board member? How you should address them? For me, an organization, an American organization, a nonprofit organization, is only as good as their board members are, which means those are really, the board is really the foundation of the efficiency of the organization. Why am I mentioning this? Of course, you can keep this in mind if you want to grow your organization in the US. I have no idea how many of you may have an entity there, how much you've worked there, but I'm also mentioning it in who you should reach out to if you're, for example, looking for just a foundation type of money. Your board members are people that sort of follow a set of rule of the games, I want to say. What, if you become a board member in an organization, there are a few things that are expected, that the board members do expect from the organization, and vice versa. Definitely, a board member is somebody who's going to be obviously your biggest fan, right? But it's also somebody who's going to dedicate money. That's always a basic. And it's going to dedicate time. It's somebody who's going to be forward thinking, someone who's going to be always engaging with their own network, trying to engage anything in their means, whether it's professionally or personally, who can have their expertise at the service of the organization. But at the same time, who is going to expect the organization to have a close relationship with them. So if you do want to reach out to a foundation, reaching out to their board is actually reaching out to their to the best entry point, to people who want to advance the organization, who have a say on the organization, who can who have also the means, and who might you might even get to a sort of second tier of network after that. So I think it's something that's very valuable to look at, both from people to reach to when you're fundraising, and when you have your own structure, really think about their role and who should you put on that board so it's actually efficient, which is sort of another topic that we can discuss further, but this is not the angle I was going for on this one.
Laure, I need to interrupt you because you're running out of time. Yeah,
okay,
just
almost there.
Okay, good. Okay.
I think we're almost there. Sorry. Yeah, you can skip to the next one. The next one was, I still want to spend a little bit of time on it. How do you want to, the donors, you know, you have somebody visit your organization, comes once, and, you know, what do you do next, right? How you're going to approach that, how you're going to maintain this relationship. One thing I always say is that keep in mind that anybody who's going to be your patron is also going to be your patron. Their first love is going to be their domestic love, right? So they're going to give first priority to their domestic theater, whichever, you know, museum, whichever that is, which is fine, because it's a way for you to get to know them. It's a way, you know, in what way they like to be engaged, you know, to which sort of level, you know, they're what's actually great indication of what they're doing and of their generosity, and also a good way to enter the relationship. Not going to go in all of those details because you're telling me that I'm really running short. But I would say one of the things about asking for money, the minute you enter the conversation with anyone, they know what the game is, right? So the minute you enter the conversation with any of the prospect, if they do enter the conversation, they know it's going to come at some point, and it's perfectly fine to talk about money. It's the whole underlying questions. So it's a question of listening, of the right timing, and also, as I mentioned here, of not asking too little, because that's both a missed opportunity, and you can even somehow offend your prospect if you're not being at the right level, where I think it's easier to ask for too much and come down than the other way around. But again, if you start having the discussion, you know, they know at some point you're going to ask for money. So if they have entered this conversation, it's fine. You shouldn't be shy about it. And then my last one, but this is more, next slide, skip this one, is about some examples about keeping in touch in some digital eras, are more about getting in touch with physically how to steward your donors, so how to be in touch with events in general. And you can go from things that are extremely small, as you again do it locally, very small cultivation event, to very large things. I would just say, if you want to do a gala, make sure you have enough people for this. Make sure you have the right crowd for it. Do not even think about putting a sort of large event together if you don't have hundreds of people you might address, and that you've been addressing for several years. So you really should think about, who do you want to address? Who do you want to involve? Do you want to involve your board members? Do you want to involve your artists? Do you want to thank your donor, or do you want to cultivate some prospects before you do put any events together? Because as I'm saying, the size really matters, and how you're going to use this to highlight a few patrons is also something to keep in mind. And again, we can spend more time on this, but there are many ways to engage physically still, whether it's directly or through partners, through what I call your network, like your friends locally, anything. I know I have to stop, so I'll let the floor to Brad for more on the educational side.
Excellent, thank you, Laure. I'll just like to ask you a question before we hand over to Brad. Do you have anything to advise when it comes up to this, use of the arts, either in other sectors or either or in fundraising for less, let's say, for art projects with a less big reputation, such as the Paris Opera or Versailles, especially when it comes up to fundraising in America? I mean, how do people react? If you come with a smaller project, for instance, or for a smaller institution.
I think I missed the beginning of the sentence. How do I fundraise for the arts for small institutions is the question?
No, if you can give us an example of how the arts can be used in other types of projects. You had the slide on using the arts in the context of social justice, or I think it was well-being and some other ideas. So can you just give us one illustrative example how to do that?
I mean, obviously you have to have a programs that make sense with it, right? So for me, I've seen this very much used in the education sector, where we've seen actually, we've had a program where we'd actually send kids to teach violin to kids, really, once a week. And then that was followed up for several years. And we actually have feedback numbers on how that improves their overall results at school. And then this is so it's even better once you're running on several years, right? Because then you can use those numbers and those feedback, KPIs basically, to fundraise for the artistic, for the house of the, for the artistic house initially, but on the base of improving the education level of those kids. And the program had been actually in one of those like not so great neighborhood. So this was really a program that was extremely successful, and you were fundraising for the theater, but through the angle of education.
Excellent. I like to see that there's some outside the box thinking actually in the US when it comes up to fundraising for the arts or using the arts in fundraising. I'm curious, Brad, what do you say about the education sector now, and how on the example of the education sector, we can learn about how to successfully fundraise in North America, what is working, how is it working, etc. Up to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Laure, for your presentation. I think the story here with respect to fundraising in the US is a story of opportunity and abundance, right? If you are paying attention to US fundraising trends. Beg your pardon?
Ah, d'accord. I think you need to turn off your microphone, please.
Hello.
Thank you. Okay.
All right.
I think Brett.
Yeah, no worries. So I hope everybody can hear me. So the U.S. story is a story of abundance. Yesterday, actually, maybe it's Monday, Giving USA released their annual report of contributions in the United States. And for the first time, at least in my memory, we almost touched $500 billion in aggregate philanthropy in the United States, which is mind-boggling to me to think that the U.S. donors have been, even through economic recession and slowdown, are giving away almost $500 billion, $499 billion a year. And today, what we'll talk a little bit about is how that impacts education, and specifically, we'll focus a bit on one of the emerging trends, not just in education, but across philanthropy, which is the rise of a specific vehicle called the Donor Advised Fund. Whenever I do presentations, I like people to walk away with something very specific. And to me, excuse me, the Donor Advised Fund and the rise of this vehicle in the United States, if you are unable to navigate that space, you're at a disadvantage. So let's start there. We have this massive market and a massive market opportunity, but we also have a rapidly evolving landscape in how donors give money. The basic principles, and Laure touched on some of them, are the same. You go back, we'll get there. Basic principle is the same. A tailored message, so know who you are, know your message and tailor it to the US market, and tailor it in the sense of the abundance that we're talking about here. Tailor, you are a unique organization. Your value proposition to those donors or benefactors in education should be unique. There are some specifics to that, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. And constantly focus on long-term relationship building. To Laure's point, the donors know why you're there, but they don't want their pocket picked. They'd like to have a deep and authentic relationship with your organization, such that they feel like their investment, that their donation or their support for your organization is really an investment, and ultimately a reflection of their personal value system, right? That's the ultimate version of this. It doesn't always emerge like that, but where you set those deep roots and that deep engagement with your benefactors in the US, you'll have a much longer and much more sort of mutually reinforcing relationship with philanthropists. Now, it still requires a tailored message. It still requires research into who you're going to target, And, I've said this to international clients all the time. The US is an enormous market, not just in terms of total number of people, but also in real estate. So, the Northeast United States, Florida, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, they're all very different in both their donor pools and sort of the composition of individuals and how they might approach philanthropy. So being very clear and tailoring your message, not just to the US market, but to those sub-markets, to me is really important. But I could talk about this all day. So let's just jump ahead. We'll talk about education here, which if you can advance the slide. Yeah, so I did not update my slides in time with the most recent report, but the Giving USA report showed about almost $71 billion in contributions to education in 2021. That is still dominated by individual donations. There is significant giving coming from foundations and industrial partners, but primarily it's an individual support. It's an individually driven function. Alumni, institutional alumni, school graduates, et cetera, are primary, though not only. Again, people tend to give to their values, not just to their historical affiliations. And I listed a few designations here. So if you're raising money in any of these spaces, again, you're going to tailor your message to those needs, but also recognize that there is a case to be made for all of these and other areas to target your support. This is just sort of a general overview. Okay, and so the biggest takeaway here, and we would provide this guidance. Another takeaway here that we would provide to our clients is when you're coming into the U.S., it's difficult to do. It's more difficult to come into the U.S. without strategic partnerships. And that could mean individuals. It could be board members, which Laure mentioned, but it could also be other organizations, universities, schools, programs, libraries, and having a joint partnership can really amplify your fundraising. It certainly can get you access to donor populations that you might not otherwise be able to access. So I don't have the data in front of me about what percentage of these donations are to joint ventures, but I do think collaborative philanthropy is a trend that is worth deeper exploration. And if you have relationships with other organizations, spending some time building those relationships in addition to donor relationships, to me, would be a logical part of your strategy. Okay, let's jump ahead. So why are we talking about donor advised funds? If you look at the trend line in donations to organizations versus the trend line of giving into donor advised funds, the difference is really stark. In 2021, the assets available in these donor advised funds reached almost $250 billion. Okay, now these are funds already given to charity. And maybe we start with the basics. What is a donor advised fund? A donor advised fund is essentially a personal giving fund, like a personal foundation. It's set up through major asset managers and allows for individuals to give a donation, but not designated to charity. Personally, they drive me crazy, but the trend line here is real. The donor advised fund is receiving a significant fraction of annual philanthropy, so much so that the top 6 destinations, 6 of the top 10 destinations for charitable giving are into donor advised fund custodians. So Vanguard Charitable, Fidelity Charitable, et cetera, et cetera. Those entities are receiving more and more donations as a percentage of total giving in the US. And in fact, last year, we'll talk about 2021 data, $72 billion of philanthropy was headed into donor advised funds and not to charity. But what's that mean? That means the assets have been donated, they're controlled by the donor, and understanding this vehicle, to me, is an important entry point into the US market. Okay, so what is that? So how do we find out who these people are? My experience is if you can identify them through your CRM, through your data management system, that's one way. If gifts are coming in from one of those custodial destinations, that's good. But having a basic procedure, even if it's simple, in terms of identifying where funds are coming in from donor advised funds, to me is worth exploring. So if you have donors who are supporting your organization, or if you learn about a donor supporting your organization through a donor advised fund, you have a procedure of deepening their engagement. And of course, you can ask them. I mean, I think, it's becoming part of the intake process for donors to ask about how they give. Through what vehicles do you typically support the organizations you care about? And most of the time, donors will self-identify that they have a donor advised fund. But if they don't, you can ask them, do you give through a donor advised fund? Just practice it in the mirror. It's worth it in the US market. So we can, oh, and I did put up here like priority funding areas. We talked a little bit earlier about tailoring your message to the donor, to the market in the US. And philanthropy as a reflection of personal values, right? So as part of a reflection of the donor's values. So if that is the case for writing a check directly to your organization, it's also the case for directing resources from a donor advised fund to your organization. And sometimes donors have plans for those donor advised fund assets. And the way it works is that the donor gives money into this donor advised fund over time, the assets build up. In fact, the average donor advised fund in the US is about $182,000. So those are funds that can be donated to other organizations, right? So sometimes the donor will aggregate multiple years of giving into one large donation, to a capital campaign, to a project, to endow a scholarship or a fellowship. And they're waiting for that opportunity to distribute those funds into a single charity, or charities that reflect their values. So that process of understanding their goal for the DAF, for the donor advised fund, to me is an important part of US fundraising. But we can jump ahead. I don't want to run out of time here. And so this is the other thing. If you're working with a donor and you identify that they're working with, they own a DAF, it would be in your best interest to help them understand that those assets have already been donated and how your organization reflects your values, right? Reflects the donor's values, right? It's okay to ask them about it. And I can't stress it enough. Getting comfortable with this donor advised fund situation in the US, to me, is a key to unlocking significant philanthropy in a potentially shorter time horizon than working with individuals to get them to give directly. I think we can jump ahead. So what does that mean, right? So with our clients and throughout my career, I've worked along this, what I call the donor commitment continuum. And depending on where your donors are along this process, will help inform your strategy, not only for engaging them, but for soliciting them eventually. We can send, I think we send this around as part of, send the slide deck around after the presentation, but ultimately there's between 7 actual full steps between ignorance of your organization and actual ownership of your mission and values. Somewhere along this continuum, each of your donors and every single constituent you engage, they reside along this continuum. So understanding where they are and engaging them and meeting them where they're at on this continuum and trying to move them along towards deeper and deeper engagement with your organization is a prerequisite to talking about anything philanthropically in the US. So while I just talked about the mechanics of the donor advised fund, major trends in the donor advised fund as something to understand in the US market, you're still operating, with donors who are someplace along this specific continuum, right? And so recognizing that in your cultivation process, to me, is a key to working with US donor. So I raced through that. So we can take questions at the end.
Thank you, Brad. That was really interesting. And what I personally understood very well from what you said, that what is really important to donors in the States, it's the values that they align very well with the organization and the work you do, and the long-term, the relationship that they can actually build up with the organization they support. And this is, in the end, something I think that all organizations are striving for, right? The long-time support and not only the one-off donation. But that brings me to a question actually about these donor-advised funds, which is how you can, so I actually 2 questions. One is it worthwhile to explore how to actually contact the custodians to propose the work you do and the organization you work with and the cause you support? That would be one question. And the other one is how to bring a donor who invests in its donor advised fund to become a regular donor to your organization.
Yeah, so the custodians and the asset managers do review lists of qualified charities. And this is not my area of expertise, but if I were entering the market, I would probably just try to understand, especially for the largest custodians, like what their process is for reviewing new entrants into the US market. Candid.org, GuideStar, which is I think the same thing now. But there are multiple rating organizations in the US for charities. Figuring out how those charitable rating systems work and being a part of it, at least getting into the system, to me would be a good first step. And your second question, you're talking specifically around how to work with those donors to become regular donors?
Yes.
Oh gosh. So, people give to people, and there's no better way to think about it than that. It's your leadership, your board, your staff. The more deeply you can engage donors in the authentic work of your organization, the better luck you will have, not only encouraging giving from their donor advised fund, but philanthropy in general. I mean, that's just the trend in the US market. And I'll give you a personal example. I was on the board of trustees for the local Audubon in our state here. And I joined the board because they needed help with, like all boards do, with fundraising, right? Like that's what I do. So I joined as their fundraising person of the board. I don't have a lot of money to give away because I work in mission-driven work, and none of us got into this to get rich. And if you did, you've been misinformed. But anyway, over time, I worked on the executive director search. I worked on the search for a new chief advancement officer. I served on the properties committee, and it became my personal largest philanthropic and volunteer activity. Me, like regular old, working person. But through that, I got to know my fellow board members who also had that experience of a deep belief and ownership, and I'll talk about this on the continuum, of the success of Maine Audubon. And so seeing philanthropists as regular old people, like we are, just, we're all, flesh and blood, like we're all people, go through that same process as I went through. They were able to make donations with more zeros, right? They were able to support the donation with the organization with larger gifts. But that process, that deep, the ability to tap into my expertise, to my passions for nature and for nature education, was the most instructive experience for me as a fundraiser, because that's what I want to replicate in my donors. So the more opportunities you have for that, to give US donors a chance to get into the real work that you're doing, there's no substitute for that.
Excellent, very interesting. And I think it joins a little bit also what Laure said when she said that you need to get the patrons, right? When she talked about the patrons into really supporting your course, be it domestically or internationally. I hope I didn't understand this wrong, Laure, but I think that's what you said, right? That you need to bring the person on the forefront, actually.
Yeah, people give to people. I think I've said the same thing than you, but I've always had that in my mind. And what I mentioned earlier was also, I wrote it, but I didn't have to mention it. But the more you thicken the relationship with the donor, the better it is, right? So in the case of the arts organization, you also have your staff, you have your board members, but you also have the artists that you may use, which are so many ways that you can approach. The more touch point you have with someone, the best it is, right? Really, when you're able to use your network, not just to reach for another person, but for having several people reach out to the same donor. That's also a really efficient way.
And I guess that's especially
important. Can I ask one question, please?
When we talk about one second. I think it's especially important when we talk about the international market, because we are all far away from our, right? Yes, go ahead.
One question, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Brad, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I'd like to know how to get access to donors advised funds in the US.
Yeah, so those funds are controlled by the individual donor. So it's different than a foundation in that they're not publicly advertised. So you have to get to know the donor first, which is a bit of a trick, right? But it tends to be a good indicator of their capacity. If they're holding assets in a donor advised fund, it's likely that they have considerable philanthropic capacity. But there are the most recent data, there's about a 1.2 million individual donor advised fund accounts in the US. And there's no ticking clock, and there's no required minimum distribution to those funds. And there's some legislation pending in the US, actually sponsored by Maine Senator Angus King, where I live, to accelerate those contributions, but it's stalled in committee. And so I do think there will be donor advised fund reform in the US in the next decade. It's just not a priority. But to your point, like to your question, spending time with individual donors, helping to, asking the question, hey, do you give through a donor advised fund? Perfectly legitimate question. And then if you do identify a person whose gift comes in from a donor advised fund, flagging them in your database for follow-up or for more deep engagement. That would be my advice. But it's I wish there were an easier solution. And if there is one, please share, please post to social media, please let us know, because we'd love to find out.
Is there any
We would, and I
online?
think some of our experts, they do actually have some experience with this also. But before I take other questions, maybe I'll use this hint on access to ask Heather how we can actually access the donations that we raise from North America, especially if we are not based in North America, neither in the US or in Canada. Heather, can you tell us about this?
I would be happy to. Yeah, just following up on what Brad was saying and tying in with Laure, people give to people, something I've said throughout my career in the fundraising and nonprofit space as well. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about North America, the focus tends to be on capacity, but it really is the relationship building that will lead to donations coming to your charity. And understanding donor motivations, certainly having touch points, but make sure those touch points align with who your donors are, what they care about, and why they might be interested in your organization. And that leads me to, with you're thinking about transferring donations, I think there's also a perception that tax benefits are the driver of giving. So just to clarify on that, tax benefits might influence the timing and the amount of giving. They're certainly an important factor, but do keep in mind that people give to people. You can't make your case for support just being about the tax benefits that you can offer to a donor. Start with what they're interested in, start with their connection with you, and then being able to offer tax benefits is just an additional bonus for them. But Anna, if you could go to the next slide, please. So there are ways that you can offer tax effective giving to your donors, and something to have a conversation with them about. I will say the IRS in the United States is a very complicated system to navigate, even for US nationals. So for your donor, depending on what income bracket they're in, what their other giving is, and what their larger picture is, they may be very interested in a tax benefit. They may not, but being sure that you have that conversation, and if that is something that they need, that you have the systems and connections in place to be able to provide that. So there are regulatory challenges and opportunities. So if you're thinking of working with a like-minded organization, so say you have a partner institution in the US or in Canada that you're working with, they can receive that gift for you, and then you can work together on how you might receive that. But there are a number of regulatory layers there, documentation that needs to be in place. It can't be a pass-through or a conduit relationship. There has to be a process, especially in the US, that needs to involve that other like-minded organizations board approving any funds that would be going to you. There needs to be a documentation around that. The IRS especially is very particular about that. And if it's not done properly, you risk jeopardizing the charitable status of the organization that you're working with in the US. So there are a number of things to have in mind if you're working with a like-minded organization, but that is a possible solution. You can also work with an intermediary, so an organization that specializes in cross-border giving that can help facilitate these things. These intermediaries are already familiar with what's needed as far as the process for moving funds across border. Those different steps that I just referenced that a like-minded organization would know. The like-minded organization might have to go and do research and find all this and consult with lawyers and accountants. the intermediary has already done all these things. They've got processes in place. It can be a very smooth and easy relationship because this is their area of expertise. So organizations such as Chapel in York, for example, but there are others out there like CAF, King Badawin Foundation, and there are others as well, can help you facilitate this. So these are intermediaries that have charitable status within the country where your donors are and can help facilitate granting of funds to you in your country. You can also apply to have your own separate legal entity within the country. So for the US, that would mean setting up your own 501c3 charitable entity, where then you are registered in the United States as a charitable organization. The donors can give directly to that separate entity that you're holding. Again, that entity then needs to take additional steps, much like a like-minded organization would, because you're separate in the registration, you're separate legally. So there are IRS things to have in mind. But again, this is an organization where your donors can give, they can receive the tax benefit. That entity would have its own board. So if you're working in education, for example, maybe you have some very active alumni in the US who could sit on the board for your US entity and help facilitate decisions about granting from that US entity to your university, perhaps in Europe or wherever you might be based. So again, that gives you a little bit more control over the process. This is really an ideal situation if you plan to have a long-term presence in the other country where you're fundraising, be it the US or Canada, that you have a strong donor base there that you expect will be in place for a while, that you are actively cultivating and growing. A separate legal entity may be a great solution for you.
Right.
So and that might be something for, a friends of organization. Laure talked about that for the arts. Many education institutions have that as well. You can apply for formal recognition of your charity with local tax authorities. The process for that in the US is called getting an equivalency determination. Again, that often has to be done repeatedly, and it can be a bit of a laborious and complicated process, but that is possible. So again, there are a number of options available to you, and really you need to think about what is your budget, what are your long-term and short-term plans within the country where you're doing your cross-border fundraising. And what level of expertise do you have versus what level of expertise would you require from anyone that you're working with, and making your decisions accordingly.
Yes, and I think this is one of the most important points, right? Because if you are at the very beginning of your fundraising journey, it's not advisable to establish your own entity, given all the paperwork and the waiting time that is involved, versus if you already are very active in your international fundraising, it can be more beneficial to you, or for other reasons, like that you have donors who actually prefer to give an entity within the US instead of abroad for reputational purposes, for instance. Then you can think about setting up your own legal entity. So I think this last point of Heather is really important, to think about what is the most adapted to your needs and to your medium to long-term strategy, also in terms of international fundraising. We are coming to the end. Are there any questions that
Can you receive slide presentations from each of your presenters?
Yes, we will send the presentation.
Via email, okay?
Yes, per email.
Thank you.
No worries. Anybody else? We are actually, it's 3 o'clock, so we are at the end of the webinar, but if there is still somebody who would like to ask a question, please go ahead.
I would jump in, Anna. I saw a question in the chat asking about stewardship, and I think that's an important point to touch on while we're having this conversation. One thing that is very important to North American donors is, and there's been extensive research on this, that the #1 reason that donors don't make a second gift to an organization is that they don't feel they were properly thanked or received information on how their gift was used. So when we're talking about stewardship, that's some of what we're talking about. A timely thank you, a personal thank you, and then an ongoing conversation with the donor, feeding back on the difference that their donation made within your organization. What was the impact of that gift? What's different now because of that donation? How did the donor touch a life, make an impact, make things better for what you are doing? And I think that kind of stewardship is really critical. That's an expectation. And if you don't meet that expectation for your North American donors, you will see your donors certainly disappear.
Very good advice. Thank you very much. That's
Finally,
really
Brad, could you please send me some contact information of how I can approach, how can I get access to donors advised funds who are donors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you're going to access, if you have the ability to talk to individual donors in the U.S., coming up with a strategy for understanding whether they individually hold donor advised funds would be great. I am aware of some prospect research organizations based in the U.S. that have started thinking about how to do this work using sort of an algorithmic approach. And if I can learn more, I will send it around.
Yeah, please. My email address, emass@stanford.edu.
Oh, great.
Okay, emass, E-M-A-T-H.
If you could put
I think you signed up with this
Stanford?
email address.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
EMATH@stanford.edu. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. And
You're
Peter
welcome.
and Anna. Thank you. Thank you all.
Excellent. Well, with this, I wish you a nice day. I hope you had you learned something about the secrets of fundraising in North America. And if you have any other question, anything that comes to your mind, feel free to send us an email, send us an inquiry. We are a big team of experts in international fundraising, so I'm sure we either know the answer or we can find the answer somewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.